We shall commence this module by understanding in brief about what we mean by globalization. Stiglitz in 2006 writes that globalization is that field on which some are major societal conflicts, including those over basics values, play out. Bhagwati in 2004 observed that columnist Thomas Friedman celebrated its virtues, while the Ruckus Society and the French sociologist Pierre Bourdieu proclaimed its vices. He commented that globalization by now has emerged as a phenomenon that has become subject to unending controversy and a focal point of hostile passions, leading to violent protest at times. He also added that globalization is a defining issue as we move further into the new century. After studying this module, you shall be able to understand the concept of globalization, know about two epochs of globalizations, a comparison, know the analytical foundation of globalization, understand the asymmetries in the current phase of globalization and their manifestations in the Indian context, know the impact of globalization on the Indian industries. Let us now understand the concept of globalization. While globalization may have many notions, Bhagwati uses globalization exclusively as economic globalization. Economic globalization, according to him, constitutes integration of national economies into international economy through various means. The means include trade, direct foreign investment, short-term capital flows, international flow of workers and technology. More precisely, globalization should be understood as a process of integration of national economies into expanding international markets through several channels mentioned. Bhagwati distinguishes between the economic globalization from other aspects of globalization, including the cultural globalization and communication. Though these forms of globalizations are not discussed here in detail, one can add that with the help of information and communication technology, along with other factors, have caused deepening of these forms of globalization. Nair distinguishes between two senses in which the concept is used, positive and normative. It is used in the positive sense to describe a process of integration into world economy. Bhagwati's concept of globalization falls in this category. The concept may also be used in the normative sense to describe a strategy of development based on a rapid integration with the world economy. He argues that globalization goes beyond international trade, investment and finance. It is about the expansion of economic transactions and organization of economic activities across political boundaries of nations. Nair defines the globalization as a process associated with increasing economic openness, growing economic interdependence and deepening of the economic integration in the world economy. It appears Nair provides a more comprehensive concept of globalization which attempts to understand the concept as a process both in terms of normative as well as positive sense that is, what is theoretically implies and what is the content in reality. The divergence of the positive from the normative has triggered the debates on the benefits of globalization being confined more to the developed than the developing world. This in turn has prompted the heterodox economist to advocate the strategic integration of the developing countries with the international economy and conserve its policy space. Moving on to discuss the two epochs of globalization. Globalization is not a new phenomenon. There was a similar phase of globalization beginning a century earlier. Circa 1870 had gathered the momentum until 1914 when it came to an abrupt end. Thus, while the world economy experienced a rapid internationalization of trade, investment and finance during the last quarter of the 20th century, there was a similar internationalization of trade, investment and finance during the last quarter of the 19th century. Nair points out to the similarities and differences between the two phases of globalization. Similarities exist in the underlying factors which made globalization possible now and then. The differences are manifested in the form, the nature and the depth of globalization now and then. Among the parallels, Nair talks about three dimensions: trade, investment and finance. He provides data to argue that integration of the world economy through international trade and foreign direct investment is about the same in the beginning and the end of 20th century. He provides data once again to argue that there occurred a significant integration of international financial markets in the early 20th century, which in some respect is comparable with the late 20th century. The only missing difference then as compared to now was the international transactions in the foreign exchange, which were determined entirely by the trade flows and the capital flows given the regime of fixed exchange rates under the gold standards. Next, we shall discuss the analytical foundations of globalization. The analytical foundation of globalization is provided by the neoliberal model. Neoliberal political economy argues that intervention in market is inefficient. The essence of the neoliberal model is very ably captured by Nair in his book Liberalization and Development. First, the government should be rolled back wherever possible so that it approximates the ideal of a minimalist state. Second, the market is not a substitute for the state, but also the preferred alternative as it performs better. Thirdly, resource allocation and utilization must be at market prices, which should conform as closely as possible to international prices. Fourthly, national political objectives, domestic economic concerns, or even the national boundaries should act as constraint in this world. Such a world view treats the domestic economic concerns as subsumed in the maximization of international economic welfare, and national political objectives are given up in the bargain. Let us now understand the asymmetries in the current phase of globalization and their manifestation in the Indian context. Bradbury argues that there exist certain structural asymmetries inherent in the current process of globalization. Globalization will be wrongly perceived inevitable if we fail to appreciate such asymmetries. The first asymmetry arises from freedom of movement of capital, especially the financial capital on one hand and the restriction placed on the other hand on the movement of labor. He shows that labor migration as a proportion of the total world population has become lower in the current phase of globalization as compared to the earlier phase of globalization, despite tremendous improvement in travel and communication technology. The asymmetry arises from increasingly freer flow of trade in goods and services on one hand and the growing restrictions on transfer of knowledge and technology embodied in the production of those goods and services on the other hand. A third asymmetry arises from the role assigned to the state in monitoring and regulating the economic activities. Interestingly, while the state cannot be trusted with expansionary monetary and fiscal policies because it has a built-in tendency for being financially irresponsible, it is assumed to perfectly capable of undertaking far more complex financial tasks, including the privatization and regulating stock exchanges. Such a view about capabilities of state has been termed as schizophrenic by Bahaduri and is rooted in denying the state its role in the development and welfare of the nation while resulting in corruption and lack of transparency in governments. The most interesting asymmetry in India is found in uneasy relationship between our political democracy and the market mechanism. Both free market and democracy extend the scope of individual choice. While the two have come to be treated as mutually reinforcing concepts in neoliberal philosophy, the relationship between the two types of freedom granted by the market economy and political democracy often tends to conflict in developing countries. Such an asymmetry becomes even more acute the greater is the inequality in the distribution of income and larger is the proportion of the poor with political voting rights but economically without a voice in the marketplace. Bahaduri argued that the phenomenon of globalization has posed a distinct challenge to our democratic form of government. It must encounter the domination of corporations of the economy through globalization. Indian democracy needs to ensure that the process of growth is not driven by the corporates, but is decentralized and employment driven to allow for the widest participation of our citizens. It is only then the wealth created by growth will be equitably shared and growth will assume a democratic content. Market must not control democratically elected government for pursuit of gain of few. Democracy must use market for the benefit of the masses. Now, we will discuss the impact of globalization on the Indian industries. One of the objectives of liberalization has been to make the Indian industries globally competitive. Towards this end, the Government of India has been pursuing three sets of reforms. One, disbanding the complex network of industrial controls, industrial licensing and permit system. 2. Liberalizing the foreign trade and currency transactions. And 3. The instituting several measures to facilitate foreign direct investment inflows. These measures were launched in the year 1991 and the liberalization process is still continuing. It was argued that the removal of entry and licensing barriers would expose the Indian firms to international competition and compel them to improve their efficiency and productivity and introduce new processes and products. Trade reforms aimed at exposing Indian firms to the global markets will compel them to produce better quality goods. Removal of import restrictions and currency transactions will enable them to import better quality materials, components and technology. FDI inflows will have technology and productivity spillover effects and would improve the productivity of the Indian firms. We have an excellent study by Siddharthan which is a little dated but provides an excellent summary of the research effort made to analyze the impact of deregulation on the Indian industry. It should be remembered that different measures to deregulate the economy include the measures to promote competition within the economy and between the domestic economies with the rest of the world. Freeing the domestic industry from internal controls and to expose it to the foreign competition went hand in hand. Thus, the result are due to both the internal and external deregulation. Siddharthan raises the following question. Have there been appreciable productivity increases in the Indian industries? Is it possible to analyze the impact of trade policy reforms on the productivity of Indian firms? He reports that some of the studies conducted for the post-liberalization period report mixed findings. Such studies include the Balakrishnan, Pushpangadan and Babu 2000, Krishna and Mitra 1998, Srivastava 1996-2000, Bartelsman and Doms in 2000, Golder and Kumari in 2003. The evidence from these 6 studies using different methodologies and different data sets do not agree with the hypothesis relating to an increase in the productivity or efficiency in the Indian industries as a result of the economic liberalization. The 6 studies include Das, Ray, Golder R, Ranganathan and Banga, Siddharthan and Lal, Banga and Narayanan. Apart from inter-industry differences, major inter-firm differences in behavior relating to technology and growth strategies and the resultant productivity and efficiency differences have been. Some firms have gained by the liberalization and globalization policies while others have lost out. The major gainers have been the MNEs and their affiliates with better access to technology and other intangible assets of different kinds. To cope up with the global regime and to compete against the MNEs, some of the domestic firms have adopted a strategy of entering into the non-equity strategic alliance with the foreign and domestic firms, resulting in technology imports against the royalty payments. These networking firms have also done well, but other domestic firms have no networking or non-equity strategic alliances could not perform well. Within MNEs also, there have been differences depending on the source country. The main advantage of the US based MNEs has been technology, while for the Japanese MNEs, efficiency advantages seems to dominate. By and large, the acquisition of technology seems to be the main vehicle of growth and domestic firms that enjoys better technological capabilities and have a smaller productivity gap in relation to the MNEs have gained from policies related to liberalization. On the other hand, firms using old technologies have lost out. Let us now discuss the globalization, labor and poverty. Balakrishnan argued that the economic constraints that bind the Indian economy are very likely internal ones rather than anything external. The current bout of the globalization is unlikely to affect her fortunes dramatically either way. He treats July 1991 as the beginning of an increasing integration of India with the world economy. It would make sense to ask what has come of poverty since then. He goes on to refer to Dayton and Dries, which concluded on the basis of their own extant estimates that poverty decline in the 1990s proceeded more or less in line with the earlier trends. They have also briefly examined other development indicators relating to health and education and observed that most indicators continued to improve in the late 1990s. On the whole, the conclusion emerges that there is no support for sweeping claims that the 1990s have been a period of either unprecedented improvement or widespread impoverishment. This, as he thought, constitutes a clear message as one is likely to get on the impact of globalization on the Indian economy as a whole, as opposed to the segments of it that are highly integrated with the rest of the world. Most Indians have either very low income or very low skills to be affected by globalization either way. Low incomes means that imports don't swamp the domestic markets, thus protecting the workers somewhat. Low skills need to be taken to imply that Indian workers cannot, under present arrangements, benefit from greater integration of the Indian economy with the rest of the world. Clearly, integration brings both the threats and opportunities. In this context, then, low buying power wards off the threat to Indian producers from multinationals, whilst low skills leads to building up of unutilized opportunities. Balakrishnan evaluates the relative importance of economic policy for the Indian economic welfare with or without globalization in terms of the background of the record of the growth in India in the last 50 years of the 20th century. He states that rate of growth of the economy may be higher since 1991, but it would be inappropriate to attribute this entirely to globalization. An even higher rate of acceleration had occurred in the early 1980s when the external sector had been liberalized very little. He concludes that with or without globalization, India's performance will largely depend upon the policies adopted. Now we will summarize what we have discussed in this module. Globalization as a process associated with increasing economic openness, growing economic interdependence and deepening economic integration in the world economy. There are two aspects of the concept. Positive and normative. The world has witnessed two phases of globalization. There exist similarities and differences between two phases. The analytical foundation of globalization is provided by a neoliberal model. Literature points out to the existence of serious contradictions in the current phase of globalization. Democracy must tame the markets and not the other way around. The major gainers from the globalization have been the MNEs and their affiliates with better access to technology and other intangible assets of different kinds. With or without globalization, India's performance will largely depend upon the policies adopted.